Hello, my name is Rosalind Love, and I'm one of the professors in the Department of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic. My Zoom background for this video is the jumble of books in my office in the department where I usually meet my students, but which I can't be in at the moment because, like most of the university buildings, ours has been closed during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. If you've watched any of the interviews in this open day playlist, you'll have seen that my background for those was a lovely balcony with trees, which is just outside the department, and which we're all missing very much, like the common room, the tea point, the library, and most of all, each other. As I hope you'll have seen from the other films in our open day playlist, in this department we study the history, languages and literatures of the peoples of early medieval Britain, Ireland and Scandinavia. The part I focus on is the bit that's not named in our title, and that's Latin. In fact, every year our open day is my chance to campaign for renaming us as Lasnack or maybe Asnackle, but nobody ever pays any attention to that. Anyway, I teach and work on the Latin text written by the Anglo-Saxons, the Irish and the Welsh. What's sometimes called Insular Latin, that is, the Latin of the islands. Although it's too complex a story to tell in full now, Latin was important all across Europe for the whole of the medieval period. First, because it had been the language of the Romans and their culture, and then more significantly, as the language which Christianity adopted for the Bible, at least in the West. It meant that after the end of the Roman Empire, people went on using Latin in Britain and Ireland just as much as in the rest of Europe. People who joined monasteries or were priests learnt to read Latin from a young age. At some periods they also had to speak it, and the quickest of them composed Latin texts too. The church used Latin almost exclusively, but rulers also used it for official documents. My guess is that Latin was also useful when you had to travel, because it was to some extent a bit like English is now, a language shared as a second language across many countries. In Britain and Ireland, Latin texts of all kinds were composed with enthusiasm, and of course some of them have become reasonably well known, like the ecclesiastical history written by the Venerable Bede. They cover all kinds of topics and genres, descriptions of journeys, letters, riddle poems, long poems with stories of saints, histories like Bede's, commentaries on the Bible, grammar books, handbooks for nuns on how to be virginal, dialogues designed to teach young monks how to speak Latin. All of this was composed in a Christian, ecclesiastical or monastic setting, mainly on religious topics, although it isn't at all by any means all of it as lofty and straight-laced as you might imagine. Also, the Latin composed in Britain and Ireland didn't exist in a vacuum. Although the term given to this Latin is Insular Latin, it certainly wasn't insular in the sense of being closed off from outside influences. The people who wrote Latin in medieval England, Wales and Ireland were, and definitely saw themselves as part of a much bigger picture of learned culture all across Europe. Like all the other languages in ASNC, you can learn Latin from scratch, and I try to get us up and running to start reading texts together as soon as possible. Latin is, of course, also one of the ASNC languages which you might have been lucky enough to learn at school. For the people who come to ASNC with some Latin, I run classes in which we dive straight into reading texts together. And by the second year, miraculously, the beginners blend in with the non-beginners, and we all move on together. For the third year of the degree, I run a course with a special focus on surviving Latin texts written by, for or about women. So, for example, we look at women's letters, like one we'll look at in a moment, stories of women who were saints, political texts written for royal women. My hope is that by the end of doing Latin within ASNC, you should be able to tackle any bit of unfamiliar medieval Latin with reasonable confidence. The Latin part of ASNC makes connections across to almost all the other parts of the course. As we'll see in a minute, some of the people who wrote in Old English also wrote in Latin. Extensive amounts of Latin texts were written in Ireland, and in fact one of the oldest texts that we read in my classes was the Latin written by St. Patrick. And we also look at the few bits of Latin which survive from Wales. Many of the key sources for the history of Britain, Ireland and Scandinavia were written in Latin. People sometimes ask how different this medieval kind of Latin is from the Latin of the Romans, classical Latin as we call it, which people learn at school. And the truth is that because most of the authors that we study had to learn Latin as a second language, the same as we do, the core of the written language, as handed down from the Roman period, stays fixed, the nuts and bolts of saying ordinary things. But the big difference that you'll notice is in the vocabulary. And that's not least because medieval Latin was Latin being written in the Christian era and needs to talk about things different from the things that the Romans were interested in. Priests, churches, nuns, monks, the Holy Trinity and such like. also the case that some of this Latin was affected, influenced by the birth language of the people who were writing and speaking it, so that words acquire slightly different meanings from the meanings that they had in classical Latin, and sometimes the shape of Latin is slightly different. Still, all of the people we're interested in learnt to write Latin to a high level, Latin that was correct, highly polished, often very, very ambitious, perhaps out of a sense of pride at the achievement of learning to use Latin. Let me give you a few glimpses of the kinds of things we read in my classes. First years who have already done a bit of Latin start with some texts which were originally composed probably to teach young monks how to speak Latin confidently, and they consist of sort of role-play conversations on a great variety of topics. One of these was written by a monk school teacher called Alfrich, who eventually became an abbot, and this is in the late 10th century, so just before the year 1000, and he's most famous for the things he wrote in Old English, especially very many sermons. But Alfrich also wrote a classroom dialogue for his pupils to use, consisting of a set of conversations between the teacher and the pupils, maybe sometimes with the pupil playing the role of the teacher, asking the questions. It's great fun, and it starts like this. Let me just share my screen with you so that I can share the text. So the boys start. Nos pueri rogamus te magister, ut docias nos loque latialiter recte, quid idiote sumus, et corrupte loquimur. We boys ask you, teacher, to teach us to speak in Latin correctly, because we're fools and we speak badly. And the teacher says, if I can get it to advance, here we are. Teacher says, quid vultis loqui? What do you want to say? And the pupils say, quid curamus, quid loquamur. What do we care what we say? Sort of whatever in Latin. What do we care what we say so long as it's correct speech and useful, not silly or coarse? And the teacher says, vultis flagellari and discendo? Do you want to be flogged while learning? And the boys reply, carius est nobis flagellare pro doctrina quam nescire. It's dearer to us to be flogged for knowledge's sake than not to know. But we know that you're kind and won't rain blows on us unless you're forced by us. Although I'm sure corporal punishment really was part of the life of the medieval classroom, I think that this is also meant to be a joke between the teacher and the pupils about who's in control of what's going on and in fact what's being said. After all, Alfrich the teacher is putting these words into the pupils' mouths. Oh yes, we want to be beaten so that we can learn better. The colloquy continues on in quite a fun way, because I think Alfrich understood very well that you learn better when you're also laughing. In case you think only boys got to go to school and learn Latin in early medieval England, I want to show you something pretty precious for our period. That is, something we know for certain was written by a woman, one of the texts we read in my third year course. Women's voices were all too often muffled or silenced in the medieval period, so it's wonderful to be able to tune into them when they're preserved for us. So what I want to show you is some bits from a letter written by a Saxon nun called Edgeburg to a friend of hers who is an abbot called Winfrith, a man who was later to leave his native England and go to bring Christianity to the people of Germany, taking on the new name Boniface. In the letter, Edgeburg is writing to Winfrith before he's left England in the early years of the 8th century. Let me show you the Latin of some parts of her letter and read you a translation. This is how she opens the letter. Caritatis tuae copulum fateor. The bond of your brotherly love I confess. While I tasted it in my heart, that flavour of it floods my inmost parts. In fact, she says, it floods her bowels with something like the sweetness of honey. And even though, as is my deserving, for the time being I may be robbed of seeing you in person, yet I go on clasping your neck with a sister's embraces. She's saying that she misses Winfrith and how much it meant to her when they were together in person. After this, she goes on to tell the sad story of how her blood brother has died. Her sister has gone far away to Rome to become an anchoress, and she's got nobody left except her friend Winfrith, from whom she's now separated. It's all deeply sad and emotional. But what's interesting is that to express her deep emotions, Edgeburg writes quite ambitious Latin, filled with long words. Such is the nature of the education that she's received. Towards the end of the letter, she concludes with how much she's longing to see Winfrith again, and she writes this. Qua propter crede mihi. Because of this, believe me, a sailor tossed by the storm doesn't long for the harbour as much as I yearn to see you again. Nor do parched fields long for the rains as much, nor an anxious mother waiting on the curving beach to see her son. It's a very lovely, vivid set of images which Edgeburg uses to express her longing. But what's sort of extra interesting about what she writes is that in fact she's borrowing these words from a letter written in Latin many years before by someone called Jerome, who was one of the great figures of the early Christian era, whose writings were studied closely all through the Middle Ages, including his very many learned letters. This comes from a letter that he wrote to one of his dear friends. That she can quote from Jerome's letter tells us something about the possible range of Edgeburg's reading, on top of the fact that she could use polished Latin to express her deepest emotions. For me, just at the moment, having got all through the lockdown caused by the pandemic, cut off from my colleagues and the fantastic students in ASNC, I really appreciate Edgeburg's words, which in letter form try to bridge the separation between dear friends. Anyway, I hope this gives you a little glimpse of what the ASNC course has to offer. Thank you.